This is Scorched Vine, a Vin Noir's production of Hope's Nocturne, written by OPL Noir and performed by Carrie Storm. Hope's Pillars, Chapter 3, Part 2, Present Day. For the sake of my sanity, what in the world does love, hope, and legacy have to do with refusing to help? Manos wondered aloud, picking up one of the many black rocks and throwing it as hard and as fast as his exhausted muscles would allow. Rage and grief over his mother's loss was an ever-present, overwhelming chasm in his chest. How both emotions could exist in the same place confused him. How could he feel both full and empty at the same time? Her absence consumed a major part of his life. He felt as if he'd lost a limb, a pillar of support, with guilt sometimes filling that empty space. Whenever he started a new day, had dinner with his sister, or caught himself laughing at something, he'd remember that she wouldn't be a part of this new experience. Life had somehow moved on without her. Like his family, this new life made no sense. Everyone he knew to be strong, safe, and dependable, his mother, his father, and Kikula, was gone. His anger with his father, his family, their neighbors, and life in general was all he had left. Losing his home, not understanding how his father could kick him out of the last place that anchored him, didn't help. He felt abandoned. In light of everything, Manos knew decisions had to be made. Where should he go now? What should he do? With his 17th birthday and graduation looming, he would soon be out of time. He needed a clear head and time to think. At least the tears stopped. Manos huffed. A cool ocean breeze dried the sweat from his brow. As he closed his eyes, for a brief moment, Manos forgot about his grief, his absent father, and his dwindling funds. Allowing fresh air to fill his lungs and the sun to kiss his lids, he felt a smile actually grace his lips. However, at the twinge of pain in his side, he opened his eyes. Ignoring his glutes, he took stock of his injuries. He'd sustained quite a few today, although he'd given as good as he'd gotten. He smiled as he remembered the left hook he'd thrown in the first quarter. The first time in weeks, he realized, becoming wistful at the memory of his last fight. Mom would be proud, he huffed, remembering his mother's admonition to let his cooler side prevail after getting into several fights preceding her death. Grabbing his shirt by the collar, he pulled the sodden garment over his head and winced. He'd found the first of his injuries, an elbow to his right side, rubbing the spot. Lifting the hem of his pants, he counted the deep red spots covering his calf and saw the 2-inch gash on his left shin. Knowing he would find similar injuries on his right leg, he didn't bother inspecting it. The injuries higher up on his hip would have to wait for a more appropriate venue. While he was currently secluded, dropping his pants would be out of the question, hence the reason behind the left hook. He shrugged, managing another smile, reopening the split in the bottom of his lip. Ouch. Concluding that his grandmother would likely catalog his injuries later, Manos decided to check for tears in his school shirt. Cringing at the garment's condition, he sighed. He would have to wash it tonight. He'd hoped to put off washing for at least another 2 days. However, between the dirt marks, sweat stains, and now blood, that would be out of the question. In his present mood, his friends barely tolerated his company. No need to add my new stench to their list of complaints. He smirked. He would be slumped over her wash basin, whether he liked it or not. His grandmother harbored a deep contempt for those who used washing machines, a sentiment shared by his mother. With this being his only school shirt, he had no choice. With the post-game euphoria wearing off, the consequences of participating had regret rearing its head. Manos slumped, staring at the school shirt in his hand. He hadn't planned on playing rugby, but their physical education teacher had insisted. He sighed. In the end, it had been just what he'd needed, injuries and all. The shirt became sodden before the end of the first half, clinging uncomfortably to him like a second skin. He'd been dragged, shoved, trampled on, but with every jab to his jaw, every crunch of cartilage or split lip he felt beneath his fist, a little bit of his rage slipped away. By the end of the game, he'd been laughing to the point of tears as they hugged it out on the field, an experience his coach called character building. While he couldn't vouch for the height of his character, if asked, he would play again, just as soon as he could secure another shirt. And remember the coach's admonition that the goal of the game was to get the ball from the other team and place it between their goalpost before beating them to a pulp. Manos smirked. He draped the once yellow, now red and brown smeared garment and undershirt over a piece of driftwood to his left. Staring up at a cloudless sky, he hoped it would dry before his friends showed up. Otherwise, his grandmother would be scandalized. If not, he cringed, I suppose I could work shirtless. Sufficiently traumatized by his last shirtless display, he didn't relish repeating that situation. On previous summers in autumn, Manos would occasionally help his grandmother in the garden. He, along with his neighborhood buddies, with Peter always chief among his cohorts, handled the tilling and heavy lifting. On one such occasion, egged on by the older boys and a few amorous girls from across the street, he'd briefly gone shirtless. To his horror, his grandmother stepped outside. She sized him up, then read him the riot act. After informing him that he had nothing to be proud of, she compared him to his father and listed the scandalous actions that had gotten the elder Sabine in trouble. She then unceremoniously sent him inside to put a shirt on. His buddies couldn't stop laughing, and Peter never let him forget it. Despite his grand's tough, no-nonsense exterior, she had a heart of gold. A gregarious woman with gnarled hands and a penchant for hugging, she believed everything that ailed you could be solved by good food. You knew you were loved when you sat at her table. Therefore, Manos was always stuffed to within an inch of his life. He loved her. He hated autumn. He resented being back here. This summer had been a difficult one. He'd helped his father with various jobs around the vineyard instead of visiting his grandmother. He'd even approached the elder Sabine about starting school a little later in the fall session at Canacal Secondary. Doing so would make it possible for him to help with the harvest. Macon, however, had other ideas. The older Sabine surprised his son by sending his transcripts to Autumn Academy. Manos thought it was an unnecessarily expensive school that they had neither the time nor the money for. When we can barely afford Marie's tuition, he thought, fuming. Grand's retirement money is good for one person. She doesn't need 2 extra mouths to feed. He remembered pleading with his father. I could have finished via correspondence course. What were you thinking, Dad? He picked up one of the black rocks from the ground, again throwing it as far as he could out of frustration. In 2 weeks, I'll be 17. Then, in 1 year, I'll be 18. And no one will be able to tell me where to go or when to leave. He consoled himself. He couldn't believe his father's high-handed actions. Macon didn't ask his opinion, tell him what he'd planned, or even given him a heads up. He just sent his transcripts to a school he'd never attend on a good day. And there'd been precious few good days since his mother's death. They'd argued all summer. Macon had been adamant that his son return to Autumn. Manos, however, had been just as determined to stay in Canacal. He stood, drifting toward the edge of the cliff. There, he had a better view of the place where water, froth, sand and pebbles collided. He braced himself against one of the trees that angled toward the water, south toward his home. He missed the snow-covered peaks. This late in October, there would be a slight chill in the air from blustering breezes flowing off the mountains. He missed the drifting fog coming off the Atlantic and the smell of brine that accompanied them. He missed the blazing color of the leaves on rows of vines that blanketed every hill as far as the eye could see. During crush, the smell of wine would be heavy in the air, and oh, how he wished he could be there now. Maybe that's why I love this spot so much. The smell of brine takes me home, back to the hills behind my house, where the ocean's waves crash against the jagged rocks below. He mused. Here in Autumn, instead of mountain vistas and tree-lined drives, he had crowded city streets, towering townhouses crammed too close together, and just enough yard to spin in a circle. His gran had become the queen of ceramic pot gardening. Those who weren't rich enough to own a townhouse lived in small bungalows. They were so close you could smell what your neighbor had cooked for lunch and who knows what else without leaving your house. He could take Ontum in small doses, a summer here, a weekend there. Being here for extended periods, however, depressed him. There just wasn't enough green growing things. But Dad refused to be reasoned with. Manos fumed, clenching his fist, glaring at the blue waves roaring in the distance. Some of that rage returned as he recalled their last heated exchange. This has been Chapter 3 of Hope's Nocturne. Happily, we can report that the book is available for sale on Amazon, if you can't wait to see what happens next. Otherwise, you can join me again next Thursday for Chapter 3, Part 3 of Hope's Pillars.